in the Washington, D.C. area. At the July meeting, I furnished her with rather sensitive documents, photos, and information related to CIA covert connections to Cuba, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and Mexico during the months and years prior to and after the assassination in Dallas. During and after the July 95 meeting, Mrs. Buttermer stated she wanted to follow up and expand on the data I provided. However, she shortly thereafter appears to have suddenly departed from the board. I have never heard from her again, and no subsequent board investigator has contacted me.
Here's the letter I got back.
Dear Mr. Wheaton, thank you for your March 31st, 1998 letter. Over the years, we have received thousands of leads and suggestions regarding the existence and location of records related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. We appreciate that you furnished Mrs. Buttermere with the materials related to the CIA, Cuba, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and Mexico City. These are all areas we have explored extensively. Please be assured that all leads are carefully reviewed and always helpful to our efforts. However, due to limited resources, it would be virtually impossible to link any records that have been released as being opened as a result of materials provided by a particular individual. Our mandate is to be completed on September 30th, 1998, and I hope that you understand our priority is to release the remaining records that relate to the assassination, but please know that your contributions to our efforts are appreciated. Again, thank you for writing. I hope this information is helpful to you. Sincerely, Eileen A. Sullivan, Press and Public Affairs Officer. And she never even addressed the question about.
My name is Gene Wheaton. I'm a retired Special Agent, Army CID. In the 1970s, I was the Narcotics and Counterterrorism Advisor to the Shah of Iran. And the way I got acquainted with Carl Jenkins is that in 1976, the three managers of a program in Iran for Rockwell Corporation, who were fronting for the CIA on a program called the IBEX program, the IBEX, they were assassinated in Tehran.
Do you recall their names?
Bill, I've got them in there. I've got just a lot. Bill Cottrell was the program manager, and two of his assistants were with him in the car when they were machine gunned to death. The two assistants just happened to be hitching a ride with him to work, and it was the wrong place at the wrong time. That was on, I believe, the 26th or 28th of August, 1976. After that, the CIA and the State Department and the embassy in Tehran asked me if I would take over as Director of Security on the IBEX program because they couldn't afford to have anybody else killed over there. And I was about the only one in the country that was really doing serious terrorism work. But I had already committed myself to the Royal Palace to go down on Kish Island in the Persian Gulf and put up a police department down there. Anyway, they asked me if I would, this was just before the assassinations, they asked me to take over Director of Security because another CIA officer, a retired CIA officer, had left that program unexpectedly in July of '76, and they had to have a security man on the program because it was highly classified. It was $1 billion airborne electronic intelligence program. And Rockwell was fronting for the CIA. When this guy left, they were left without a security director. And when I told them I had to go down on Kish Island, they asked me to wait and make a final decision until Bill Cottrell came back from home leave in the United States. And I had an appointment to meet with him the morning that he was assassinated, but he was assassinated on his way to work before I could ever meet with him. And then they contacted me and tried to get me to change my mind about Kish Island, but the Shah's Royal Court had asked me to go down there, and I couldn't hardly turn them down. So another retired CIA officer came in and took the place of the one who had departed before the assassination, and his name was Johnny Harper. They call him I.W. Harper. He had been in Libya with Edwin P. Wilson, CIA officer who was prosecuted for shipping 40,000 pounds of C4 explosives to Libya and training Libyan terrorists. I.W. Harper was a shooter in explosives, and he was a assassination specialist, is what he was. And so Bob Woodward was getting ready to come out with an expose on Ed Wilson's dealings with Colonel Gaddafi as an intelligence officer and with allegedly some covert U.S. backing. And Stansfield Turner sent correspondence by courier over to Tehran and told I.W. Harper he needed to get out of the country because they couldn't guarantee his safety because Woodward was coming out with these articles. And I was again contacted, and I had finished setting up this police department on Kish Island, and they asked me if I would take over, and it was a critical thing because Harper and his wife, Lou, were given 48 hours to pack up and get out of the country, so I agreed to take over as director of security. That's how I first got acquainted with I.W. Harper. Harper was a protege and worked for Carl Jenkins all during the days from the Bay of Pigs clear up through Vietnam and various other places. And when I came back from Iran during the revolution, 79, I.W. Harper introduced me to Carl Jenkins, and I became very close friends with him.
And who was Carl Jenkins?
Carl Jenkins was a retired high-level paramilitary specialist with the CIA. He headed up the largest covert base in Laos during the secret CIA wars over there while the open war was going on in Vietnam. And Carl and I was, after the Iranian Revolution, I couldn't go back to Iran because I had a kind of a bounty on my head from the revolutionaries. And
they wanted to kill you.
Yeah, and several other people, not just me. But so I was going over to Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and Egypt to do security work.
Who would assign you?
I picked my own work. I was a freelance consultant.
So there was no one from Washington, CIA?
No, I would always contact those people, and I got my name put on a list at the State Department of preferred specialist if anybody overseas needed me, and I would get telexes from Washington saying the Egyptians need some security over here, the Saudis or the Pakistanis, and if you're interested, here are the numbers to contact. And nobody was my boss, nobody paid me anything.
Can you tell us who some of the people were that you dealt with within the government?
Just the Middle East desks and the State Department's. We have an office for contracting for American companies. They try to push business to American companies overseas. I will always maintain liaison with them and with the embassies and with the DIA and CIA and the Pentagon.
So it's kind of middle level that you would be involved with rather than the heads of agencies, is that?
Well, part of it was both. As time went on, I got acquainted with much higher people.
Are you able to tell us who they are? Or
sure, I used to party with Bill Casey and then Vice President George H.W. Bush. My wife and I were invited to parties with him. I had a mentor in Washington who was Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania. He was the Senate's minority leader under the Nixon administration. And Hugh Scott and I became very close friends, and so he opened a lot of doors for me in the foreign countries and introduced me to the Egyptian ambassador Corval, and they invited me to Cairo to do a counterterrorism security survey of Cairo International Airport. And I took a team of Bechtel engineers to Saudi Arabia and designed a security system for the new Jeddah airport in 1979. I was introduced to Pakistani ambassador Ejaz Azim, who was also a former two-star general in the Pakistani Army and ISI, the Inter-Service Intelligence. And I went to Pakistan several times on aviation security-related matters and helping them with their program for setting up sky marshals because one of their airplanes had been hijacked and taken to Kabul, Afghanistan, and a young Pakistani diplomat was shot and thrown out on the tarmac over in Kabul, and so they were concerned about that, and I gave them a little advice and help them what they could do about their air marshal program.
Thank you. So let's go back to Jenkins then.
Okay.
Yeah.
And anyway, 79, 80, and it evolved over a number of years that Carl and I and his wife, who was also a senior CIA officer, he was retired, but he was sort of a case officer. He had been the secret police of Somoza down in Nicaragua, and she had been his interpreter before they got married. And he got her master's degree. They got married and got her PhD, and pushed her through college and helped her with it, and sort of became his own wife's case officer. And he couldn't no longer get promoted up through the ranks because he was retired doing contract work for him, but she could because she was still in. So she was the head of one of the divisions of the CIA. She had all of their psychologists, PhD, shrinks and everything under her command.
So how did you get so close to Jenkins?
We just hit it off, and I was flying back and forth to Washington, D.C. from Southern California, and at some point in time, he invited me to use an extra bedroom in their home, and so I would leave my papers and clothes and things in there so that I wouldn't have to haul them back and forth to California each time I went to Washington, or if I was going overseas, I'd stop off in Washington and see him on the way. He opened doors for me, and I opened doors for him. And in 1985, he became my Washington representative when I took over as vice president of a cargo airline called National Air. And this was during the Iran-Contra thing, and they wanted my airplanes for the Contras and to haul weapons down to Honduras and whatever else they might want to haul. And I think you have documentation where I made him my Washington rep for.
I have a document.
For National Air.
Right.
And he took me around, and he and some other CIA people introduced me to Rob Owen, who was Ollie North's outside man with the Contras, and breakfast was set up with me with Adolfo Calero, who was the head of the Contras in Washington. I mean, he flew up to Washington and had breakfast together. They wanted my airplanes for that, and they wanted my background in the Middle East and counterterrorism and the airplanes to help support the Afghan Mujahideen fighting the Soviets during the after December 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and there was the Afghan Mujahideen, which they now call the Taliban, was fighting the Soviets, and we were supporting them with military assistance and training and so forth. And I would fly back and forth to Pakistan, go up on the northwest frontier province and Peshawar and that area on the Afghan border, mess around with those guys. So,
now, as the story goes, you got so close that you're living with Jenkins.
I was like a brother to Carl.
So, we're so limited on time, or I wouldn't.
I know.
If, as the story as I understand it, you hung out here and were basically as close as brothers. He came to trust you a great deal, and he has Cubans.
Oh yeah.
Tell me the story.
Carl was the head recruiter and trainer for the Bay of Pigs invasion, for the assassins and the saboteurs that were going into Cuba in the pre-invasion to lay the groundwork for the Bay of Pigs. And Carl recruited 17, 18, 19-year-old Cuban exiles down in Miami and in Guatemala and trained them, and he became their father figure. And these Cubans, several of them were captured at the time of the Bay of Pigs and imprisoned in Cuban prisons. And Carl and some of his colleagues negotiated their release by its historical record about negotiating some tractors for Castro and some medical supplies. And
So he was
like that.
he was part of all that.
He was the head of it.
He was the head of that.
He was the head of the infiltrators, the terrorists, the assassins. Ted Shackley was the head of the Miami station, and Carl worked directly for him. And Rafael Quintero, Chichi Quintero, was one of those Bay of Pigs guys who got caught, and then when they got him out, Chichi became a very, like a son to Carl, and he and 2 or 3 others, Felix Rodriguez, Nestor Pino, all went through Vietnam with him, and then Africa and the Congo when they were having those things with, I think, Patrice Lumumba, when they were trying to overthrow that government over there.
Did you ever meet those guys?
Yes.
You did meet.
Chichi Quintero used to come up to Carl's place in Washington, Fairfax, Virginia, and stay at his house where I was staying. And Carl and I would go out to National Airport and pick him up. He was living in Miami.
So you did get to know him. Did you get to know him well?
Pretty well. Chichi would come up there. Chichi had a problem with his daughter was starting to Georgetown University, and she had some emotional problems that I won't go into, but he wanted to discuss them with me, and he would fly up there and we would talk, and Chichi and Ollie North and General Richard Secord, some of those key players in Iran-Contra affair, would all go over to a spook attorney's office when he would come up there, a guy named Tom Green, and discuss their strategies. That was before the 21st of November, '86, when all the thing blew open wide. And after that, when they started seeing that there was probably going to be some legal matters, that they all had to have different attorneys, they split off. But up until that time, they all met with Tom Green regularly.
Now, when you got to meet these exiles, and I remember you told me when we first talked that you're sitting around, they got to know you so well that they started talking about things. Just they were not guarded.
I lived with Carl. I ate with him. We went to dinner together, he and his wife and me, and when those guys were up, the Cubans were up there, or other retired CIA officers, we all would meet at least on weekends when I was in Washington, and have barbecues together and go out to dinner together and Oriental food, because they'd spent so many years over there, and we were all clustering around in McLean, Virginia, and Fairfax and those areas, and it was just like a family. And they talked directly to me and to each other in my presence, as if I was, one of the spook crowd, covert crowd.
If I could just, without taking you off the topic you're going to about discussions with the Cubans, do you recall which other CIA officers would have also been privy to this?
Well, I'm going to have to think that over before I blurt it out. So I know a lot of them. Yes.
Okay, so please go ahead.
But
I asked you once about, did they ever talk about the JFK assassination? And I said, how'd that make you feel? And you said something like, I pretended like I was deaf.
Well, in the beginning, I just, whatever they'd talk about, it was just, I would absorb it and listen to them, and they would talk to each other. But as time went along, I started feeling Carl out, and Chichi Quintero particularly, because Chichi was a shooter, and he was trained by I.W. Harper. And I started feeling these guys out about their involvement with the Kennedy assassination, because Carl was from Louisiana, and he was the CIA's liaison with Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss down there, and connected him with Sam Giancana and John Rosselli and those other guys who are in public record as being part of that crowd of mafia guys that they say were interconnected to the Kennedy assassination.
Did you learn in the discussions whether that was true?
Well, I learned what they said. They said it was true, and I had been working with Senator Scott, Hugh Scott, to see if we could get the record set straight on the Kennedy assassination after so many years. And Chichi Quintero's wife, Dolores, out of Miami, and they had a son up at Ivy League school in New England and a daughter at Georgetown. And, you know, he had family responsibilities they didn't have when he was a young hotshot shooter and an explosives man and stuff. And I said, if you guys will, you know, set the whole record straight, Senator Scott and I will try to work through the White House and the Senate to get you total immunity if you'll just tell the whole straight story.
So, as he told it to you, what is the straight story?
The straight story is that there was a CIA-funded program to assassinate Castro. And Carl was in charge of training the Cubans from Miami to assassinate Castro, and it was paid for by the CIA. And they would go from Texas down to Mexico and take old convertibles and things down in the hills and the rocky areas and stick watermelons up in the back seat and plunk them. They had a thing called a triangulation shooting team. And they were, according to them, and that they were the ones that diverted the Castro funds and training for their own agenda to snuff Kennedy.
A rogue element, in other words.
Well, it was partially. It was a paid element, and they were CIA people.
They were.
But they were training to assassinate Castro. But if you train to assassinate one man, you can assassinate anybody with that same training. And that's what they were using the paid training program to divert, to get Castro because of his, well, the Cubans, because of the imprisonment of those guys and because of the failed Bay of Pigs thing and JFK backing off at the last moment on supporting the Bay of Pigs invasion.
So they were still angry.
Oh, they were
all these years later.
Furious, and they still are to this day, the ones that are still alive.
Now,
and there was another clique above them that was worried about Kennedy not increasing the program to escalate hostilities in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So that at an extremely high level, and I'm talking about at the political elite level within the shakers and movers of the country and with the very top people in the CIA and the Pentagon and the White House, they didn't want Kennedy to shut down that war because it was just trying to get it. They were just trying to get it warmed up in the early '60s. They wanted it to escalate so that they would have a long. The war in Vietnam, you know, was I was chief of CID at one of the largest CID bases in Vietnam, '67, '68.
So tell me some of the names of the people, the Cubans that were involved in this.
Well, I say I'm going to think about who I'm going to tell you, but
okay. Was Chichi involved?
Chichi and Carl Jenkins were in charge of the main thing. Carl was training Chichi and several other shooters, about 5 of them. And I.W. Harper was helping train these guys to assassinate Castro. And then they just, according to them, they went off and decided to get their revenge on Kennedy for his failure to support the invasion of Cuba.
Did they give you specific operational details on the Kennedy assassination?
I mean, they told me some things about the Louisiana connection down there with Carlos Marcello and
for example,
Lee Harvey Oswald was just a stooge that Carl and his friends recruited. See, Carl, back in the early 50s when he came back from Korea, formed the first Marine Corps Reserve. Carl was a captain in the Marine Corps back then, and he was a CIA officer. And he formed the first Marine Corps Reserve unit in New Orleans, Louisiana. And he was the CIA liaison between CIA headquarters and Carlos Marcello and the organized crime down there. And Lee Harvey Oswald was a young guy that, because of Carl's connection to the Marine Corps Reserve and his involvement in the CIA, helped recruit Lee Harvey Oswald into the CIA while while Lee was a Marine. And of course, the history of Lee, I'm not going to go into all that. I mean, going to Japan was a linguist, and all that stuff going to Russia. But the way, and then keep in mind, this is not all somebody sitting down and telling me this one day. This is over months and years of talking to me and talking to each other in my presence. That it just was obvious that Lee was a stooge that they set up to. They always have what they call an OPSEC plan, operational security plan, for deniability when they put a real dirty covert operation into place.
What did Oswald think his role was? What did he think he was doing?
I don't know. I didn't talk to Oswald.
They
I
didn't
have no idea what he thinks.
When they would talk to you about this, what was their manner? Was it like, we really put it over?
No, it was just like we were talking about what we're going to have for dinner tonight. It was just, we were just so close that we just talked about everything together.
Did they talk about?
Or they would get down and kind of reminisce about what went on in the past, what went wrong, what went right.
Did it scare you?
And they would do it in front of me.
Did it scare you when they would talk like that?
No, it didn't scare me. I've been a cop and an intelligence agent all my life.
Do you know who specifically was Oswald's handler who brought him into it?
I know Carl Jenkins was involved in it. I don't know if he had another handler else.
Are there, other than the broad strokes that you've told us, are there any other more specific details?
Well, I don't know. This is stuff that I'd have to just sit down and it's too quickly a time
I understand.
To go back that far back. I'm talking about 20 years ago.
The reason we ask is, of course, the more details we can get, the more ability there could be to verify, and I know that you're on a tight
and
schedule.
we're going to have to shut down right now because I'm going to have to go.
Just one more question.
Okay.
Did Jenkins ever mention David Morales or anyone named Zemeca, El Indio, or the Big Indian?
Oh, I don't know.
Is Jenkins still living?
Jenkins is probably living. He's about 78 or 80 years old. His birth date is on that passport.
When you said, you guys, if you tell the straight story, I'll work with this congressman, senator, and we'll do something.
Yeah.
Were they willing?
When I suggested that they get the history record straightened out and get the immunity so that Chi-Chi could go on with his wife and kids, and I kind of played on that for him so that he could live a normal life and his family could, and he was a very family-oriented man. They said, let us think about it.
Did they ever get back to you on it?
Oh, yeah, I was back with them all the time. They never left me. I mean, I was about a month later, 6 weeks later maybe, Carl and Chi-Chi had flown up from Miami again for one of those meetings with Tom Green and Ollie North and stuff. And Carl got me out and says, we've been giving it serious thought, but we've decided that we're just going to let things stand as they are, and if you ever try to change the record, we'll just totally discredit you and deny everything.
Thank you.
Do you know where Jenkins is now? Where he may be
Carl
living?
and Elizabeth got divorced. I was testifying in federal court in Washington, D.C. in '87, March, I think, concerning the events around the Iran-Contra affair, and Carl's name was brought up by the attorneys interviewing me. And the CIA transferred Elizabeth to, I believe, Japan to get him out of the limelight and away from me. And Carl went with her wherever, I think it was Japan, but I wouldn't swear to it. And he went with her as her dependent because he was retired CIA. And they later came back from there. Now, I haven't seen them since then. They broke off contact with me at that time, but I have other people that know them. And they came back, and Carl, from what I was told, Carl and Elizabeth got divorced. She stayed with the agency, and he married some Panamanian woman and went down to Panama and was facilitating weapons and money movement in Panama later. And I've heard that as he got older, he came back up to the Washington area, either Washington, Baltimore area, and that's the last thing that I've heard about where he is. I've never heard that he's dead.
Right.
And I've never tried to reach him again.
Did he ever discuss the names of the actual shooters? Did that ever come up?
No. They all use phony names when they do the stuff like that anyway.
Would you like to try to meet him again?
Oh, I like Carl. He's an interesting character. But he and his wife arranged through the CIA for me to be flown to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1986. to get me out. No, 87 to get me out of the limelight after the Iran conflict. They were trying to. First, he was helping me in the Iran conflict. There's 3 or 4 different factions in the CIA and the Pentagon that were pushing different agendas. And Carl, clear up until the Iran-Contra thing broke, was feeding me information on Ollie North and Secord and all of those guys. And I briefed CIA Director Bill Casey on it in the spring of '86. He said he'd get back to me, and got back a few weeks later and said, CIA's not involved in this thing, and if you want to expose it, you go ahead. And then I briefed the staff of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, P.X. Kelly, said, get Ollie North out. I didn't know Ollie North was that deeply involved, and I thought he might have been using Secord and Albert Hakim and those guys just as a convenience thing. But I told them that since the CIA and everybody in Washington was denying any government involvement, I was going to expose it because I knew that they were moving weapons.
What was your motivation to expose all this?
I'm a cop. They're stealing American people's money.
Yet at the time
they were stealing billions of dollars worth of weapons paid for by your tax dollar, and they were selling them to terrorist states. They were selling to both Iran and Iraq, and they were pocketing the money and sticking it in Swiss bank accounts and the Turks and Caicos Islands. And
for themselves or to fund programs?
Both combination for themselves and to run covert operations without government approval. It was at that time a renegade, standalone, as Ollie North said. Bill Casey wanted to have a standalone, self-financing, covert intelligence capability without congressional approval. That was part of the Iran-Contra testimony, and that's what they were doing. And to me, they were stealing your taxpayers' dollars, weapons paid for by your tax dollar, and selling them to terrorist states. And to me, just as a citizen, besides being a cop and a retired military guy, I felt that was extremely wrong, you know. And anyway, I was summer of '86, after I briefed Casey and they denied it, I briefed Commandant of the Marine Corps. Ollie North stayed in there. I told him to get him transferred to Okinawa and give him a medal and get him out of the heat because I did not want to embarrass the Marine Corps, because I'm a former Marine even though I'm retired from the Army. And after the Iran-Contra thing broke, General Kelly sent a message back to me thanking me for giving him a heads up before it happened, but he tried to transfer Ollie and the White House wouldn't let him.
The White House wouldn't let him?
Yeah.
I guess he was sweeping up the basement or something. Thank you so much. Were there any other people there that would still be living, maybe young Cubans or whatever, that would also be able to corroborate what you're saying?
None of these guys will talk. They were talking within their own clique. They won't talk to outsiders about this kind of stuff.
Is Quintero alive still?
Yes, as far as I know. He should be about 60 now.
Do you know what? He would only be 60.
I think
he was a young guy.
Well, he was only 17 or 18 years old at the Bay of Pigs, so you can add it up from then. And
are there any other guys you can think of that
well, there was another one of them that was, Carl was his protege. He was about Chi-Chi's age. His name was Nestor Pino. Nestor Pino, Carl, when he got him out of prison in Cuba, got him a commission as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. And when he became captain, he wanted to be involved in stuff down in Central America rather than Army stuff around the other part of the world. So Carl, he got him commissioned in the Marine Corps as a second lieutenant. And Carl, when he was a captain, arranged for him to be transferred from the Marine Corps to the Army. And I met Nestor Pino the first time in 1985, and Carl Jenkins introduced him to me in an office of the State Department. And they took me up on the hill to Congressman Bill McCullum's office, 5th District of Florida, and introduced me to Rob Owen and Congressman McCullum's assistant, administrative assistant, a guy named Vaughn Forrest. And that is what got me into the Iran-Contra affair. And Nestor Pino went up there with us. Nestor is subsequently retired as a full colonel in the U.S. Army. And as far as I know, is still alive. After he retired, I think he was teaching at the Army War College or down at that School of the Americans at Fort Benning or Bragg or someplace.
Was he ever part of the JFK thing?
I don't know. I do not know.
Nothing you ever heard?
Well, he was part of that crowd.
Part of the
I don't
crowd.
know whether he was actually there. Carl Jenkins was very active in Mexico. In fact, when he came back from Korea, or just after World War II, before Korea, he studied at Mexico City University. He was a Spanish linguist, and Central America and Mexico was his baby.
Did they talk about
Him and a guy named Nestor Sanchez. They were the ones that set up the death squads down in El Salvador, and Nestor Sanchez was a CIA officer who was so bloody that his own associates wouldn't have anything to do with it.
Did they
Some
talk-
other type. Now, I can tell you where you can get more precise interview of me, and that is from a guy up in Minneapolis, or St. Paul, Minnesota. His name is Matt Ealing. He does documentaries. He's an independent producer, does documentaries for, primarily sells them to PBS and National Public Radio, and he's been down here and interviewed me over the last 7 or 8 years a dozen times, and he's got me on raw video footage, hours and hours and hours, and on tape concerning most of what I'm talking to you guys